I still remember the exact shade of the sky that evening, the way it turned a dull and heavy orange, like the sun was being smothered behind a thick curtain. It was the kind of sky that made the forest look deeper than it really was. I should have turned back right then, but I told myself it was just weather. Nothing more. The kind of lie you tell yourself before everything goes wrong. I had gone camping alone before, but never in this part of the forest. It was farther from town, quieter, untouched in a way that felt almost intentional, as if things stayed undisturbed here, as they wanted to. The ranger at the entrance had casually mentioned that most people avoided the deeper trails. He didn't say why. He just gave me a long look, the kind where someone wants to say more but decides it's better if you don't know. I laughed it off and kept walking. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the air had already changed. It had that metallic stillness before a storm, but the clouds weren't right. They were sitting too low, dragging themselves across the peaks like bruises that refused to fade. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on small tasks, clearing the ground, setting up the tent, getting a small fire started. Routine is a good distraction. You don't notice your hands shaking if they're busy. I ate early, watching the forest darken around me. Every sound felt amplified. The rustling leaves, the distant snaps of branches, the faint whine of wind slipping through the tall pines. I tried telling myself it was peaceful, but the truth was it felt like the forest was listening. Not watching, listening, like it was waiting for something. The first strange thing happened when I went home my feet down. I tossed the rope over a sturdy branch, but before I could pull it tight, another rope swung down from above, landing a few feet from my neck. It was old, frayed, and tied into a loop. My first thought was that someone else had been here. My second thought was that the knot was too intentional, too practiced, the kind of knot used for trapping animals, or something else. I looked up, but the branch was too dense to see anything. When I tugged the rope, it slipped away like it had never been there, disappearing into the brush so quickly it might have been pulled. I stood frozen, failing to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But I forced myself to continue with the night. I didn't want fear to dictate my imagination. Hours passed. The forest grew heavier with darkness. The fire burned low, cracking softly. I climbed into my tent and lay still, listening to my heartbeat fill the silence. Sleep never came. Something else did. It started with a soft crunch of leaves. One, then another. Slow, deliberate. Too heavy to be an animal, but too controlled to be someone stumbling blindly. It circled my tent, each step measured, as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I didn't move, not even to breathe more than necessary. The steps continued until they stopped right behind my head. That silence was worse than the footsteps. Minutes stretched. Then, faintly, something pressed against the thin fabric of my tent. Not a hand, not a paw, something long, thin, like a stick being pushed from the inside by someone testing the surface. It dragged downward, slow enough for me to feel every inch. I wanted to scream, but fear pinned me to the sleeping bag of the weight. Eventually, the dragging stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving away, not into the distance, just far enough to be out of reach, but still close enough that I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, the forest looked normal again. Birds chirped. Sunlight filtered through the branches. Nothing looked disturbed. The ground around my tent was smooth, no footprints, no signs of movement. But the tree beside me had a mark. A long vertical line carved deep into the bark, starting at eye level and running nearly to the ground. As if someone had traced it during the night. I packed fast. I wanted to leave before anything else happened. But the forest didn't want me to leave quietly. Halfway down the trail, I heard it again, steps matching my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. When I sped up, they stayed just behind me, hidden among the trees. I didn't look back. Every instinct in my body screamed, not to. The ranger station appeared in the distance, but just as I stepped out of the tree line, something caught my eye. A rope hung from a branch behind me, old, frayed, tied into a loop, just like the one from last night. Only this time, there was something carved into the tree beside it. Letters. Deep. Rushed. Uneven. It was my name. Freshly carved. I never told the ranger my name when I checked in. I still don't know who or what was in the forest with me. I only know that sometimes, when I walk near any wooded area, I hear footsteps behind me again. Always just far enough that I can't see who's following. And every time, without fail, I find a rope somewhere nearby. The same kind, always tied into a loop. If you'd like, I can continue with story 2 next, each one perfectly within 7,000 to 7,650 characters. Just say. I remember the morning it happened because the air felt warm the moment I stepped out of my car. It was colder than it should have been for early autumn. Cold enough that the breath I exhaled drifted longer than usual, hanging in front of me like a warning I pretended not to notice. I had come to the forest to clear my head after a rough week, telling myself fresh air would do me good. But as soon as the gravel crunched under my boots, I felt that familiar sinking feeling, the one that tells you something is off long before your mind catches up. The trailhead sign was half rotten, the paint faded, the map torn. Only 2 markers remained readable, a faded arrow pointing deeper into the woods, and a warning about increased predator activity. That should have been enough to send me home, but I pushed forward, convincing myself I needed the break more than I needed common sense. The first hour was uneventful. The forest was quiet and heavy rain, like everything was holding still out of respect or fear. Even the birds barely made a sound. My path felt heavier than usual, my steps slower. I kept telling myself it was just fatigue, not the creeping pressure building in my chest. Eventually, I reached a small clearing near a stream, a perfect place to set up camp. The water was slow and strangely clear, so clear I could see every stone beneath the surface. I knelt to refill my bottle, and that's when I noticed the stones were inactive. They were arranged in a perfect circle. Someone had placed them there. Recently, I backed away, telling myself it was harmless, maybe something a previous camper made out of boredom. I set up my tent, unpacked, forced myself to relax, but my eyes kept drifting back to that circle of stones. The way it looked too intentional, too precise. As the day faded, the forest dimmed fast. The sun barely touched the treetops before everything sank into a dull blue haze that made it hard to tell distances. I cooked a simple meal and sat by the stream, listening to the water move like a whisper. I tried to enjoy the peace, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt absurd. The first real sign came just before dusk. A tree about 20 meters away shook violently, as if something massive hit it. Not like wind, not like an animal brushing past. It was a single impact, sharp and sudden. The forest went silent instantly. My instinct screamed at me to get inside the tent, so I did. I sipped myself in and sat there, holding my breath, waiting for something else to happen. It did. Not footsteps, not movement in the brush. What I heard was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, close enough that I could pinpoint where it stood outside my tent. It was on the opposite side of the fabric, just inches from my head. At first I told myself it was a deer, but the rhythm was wrong. Too controlled, too deliberate. Like someone was making sure I heard every inhale. I stayed frozen until the breathing stopped. Minutes passed. Then the soft crack of a twig snapped behind my tent, followed by another impact against a distant tree. Another sudden violent thump. Then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn I stepped outside carefully, expecting to see tracks or some sign of an animal. Instead, I saw something worse. The circle of stones in the stream had been rearranged. The stones now formed an arrow, pointing directly at my tent. There were fresh marks in the dirt beside it, drag lines, like something had been pulled from the stream bed toward the tree line. I packed as fast as I could. Every sound felt like a threat. Every shifting shadow felt alive. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to get out, but something followed. I realized it halfway through the hike out when I heard the same breathing again. Not close, but somewhere in the trees behind me. Too steady to be an animal. Too quiet to be accidental. Every time I slowed down, the breathing grew louder, as if whatever it was wanted me to know it was still there. At one point, I turned sharply, hoping to catch whoever was behind me off guard. I didn't see a person. I didn't see an animal. I saw movement, just the faintest suggestion of a figure between the trees, standing so still that if I blinked, I would have convinced myself I imagined it. I ran after them. Not a sprint, but a desperate fast walk, trying not to look terrified, even though my chest felt like it was collapsing on itself. The breathing followed until I reached the final stretch of trail, where the forest thinned and sunlight broke through. The moment the trees opened up, the sound stopped, completely, like someone flipping a switch. When I reached my car, the relief nearly dropped me to my knees. I tossed my backpack in the passenger seat, slammed the door, and tried to calm down. But as I adjusted the rearview mirror, something made my blood turn to ice. There was mud smeared across the back of my shirt, a long smear dragged from my left shoulder to the center of my spine. Something had touched me during the night. I drove without stopping until I reached home. I washed my clothes 3 times. I didn't sleep properly for days. But the part that still haunts me isn't the breathing, or the stones, or the shadow in the trees. It's what I found 2 weeks later, when I finally unpacked my backpack. At the very bottom of it, underneath the clothes and food, was a stone, a perfectly smooth river stone, with an arrow carved into it, pointing upward, toward the opening of the bag, as if someone wanted me to know they had been inside my tent, and they wanted me to know they weren't done with me.
I never thought the sound of a zipper could haunt me, but even now, years later, the faint rip of fabric sliding open still sends a cold pulse through my spine. It brings me right back to that night in the forest, the night I thought camping alone would help me clear my mind after months of stress. It was supposed to be simple, one night away, a quiet hike, and the kind of silence that helps you breathe again. Instead, I ended up learning that silence can be something much darker and miles away from anyone with a green called for help. The day began normally. I parked near an old service road that barely showed up on maps anymore. A forest that was thick, uneven, and rarely visited, which is exactly what attracted me. I stepped out of the car and felt that immediate shift in temperature that happened when the heat forest swallowed the ground. It was cooler and denser, like the air had weight to it. My plan was to hike for 2 hours, find a clearing near water, set up camp, and return the next morning. The forest was quiet, unusually so. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals. Just the steady crunch of my boots and the distant drum of trees bending ever so slightly. It felt like walking through a place that hadn't seen another person for a long time. I found a clearing just before dusk. It wasn't perfect, but it had flat ground and fallen logs I could sit on while cooking. The trees around it formed a loose circle, tall and thin like pillars holding up the sky. The ground was littered with pine needles and patches of mud. A narrow footpath ran behind the clearing, overgrown and barely visible, leading deeper into the forest. I didn't like the way it looked, but I tried to ignore the feeling. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I got a small fire going and heated a simple meal. The smoke drifted upward in a perfectly straight line, barely disturbed by the wind. It was strange, but at the time I welcomed the stillness. I noticed the first odd thing when I went to gather more firewood. Not far from the clearing, maybe 20 meters away, I spotted a set of footprints in the dirt. At first I assumed they were mine, but the moment I stepped closer, I knew they weren't. The prints were wider and deeper, like someone heavier had walked through them. There were only 4 or 5 steps, and then they disappeared into the dark. No direction, no trail. Just gone. I returned to the fire feeling uneasy, telling myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe an old trap, maybe distorted by wind. I stayed by the fire until it ended the wind, and climbed into my tent, zipped the door shut, and lay still listening to the night. The absence of sound was unnerving. Not a single animal, not a single rustle of leaves. The forest felt empty in the way a forest should never feel. I turned on my small lantern and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is waking suddenly, heart racing. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound, no movement, nothing that should have started me. But something felt different, heavier. The air inside the tent felt warm, like it was trapping my breath. Then I heard it, a soft shift of weight on the ground, right outside the tent. So subtle that if I hadn't been awake, I might have missed it. A slow step, then another, moving around the tent, careful and steady. I held my breath. Steps circled, pausing occasionally, as if whoever it was trying to figure out the exact shape of the tent. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After what felt like minutes, the steps stopped, right behind my head. The fabric of the tent pushed inward slightly like something, or someone being close. I stayed frozen, eyes wide open in the semi-darkness. The pressure lasted only a second, but it felt like an hour. Then the zipper sounded. Not loud, not fast, just a faint dragging of metal feet separated. My tent door was being opened from the outside. I resisted the urge to sit up and run. Instinct told me any sudden movement would make things worse. Instead, I kept completely still while the zipper lowered one agonizing effort at a time. Cold night air strode in. I waited for a hand, a shadow, anything to enter, but nothing did. The zipper stopped halfway, hung there, and then silent. No footsteps walking away, no breathing, no movement at all. Whoever opened it was still there waiting. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that. 20 minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, the cold creeping into the tent forced me to move and finally. I reached for the lantern, turned it on, and shined it toward the partially open entrance. No one was there. I scanned the tree line through the small opening, but all I saw was darkness layered between the trees. I zipped the tent shut again, fast but quiet, hands trembling uncontrollably. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn came, the forest finally moved more. Birds chirped, branches creaked in the morning breeze. The normalcy felt almost insulting after what had happened. I stepped out carefully, scanning the ground. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones. Leading right up to my tent, and then stopping. No prints walking away. No signs of retreat. Just a series of steps running directly beside where they had been. I followed them cautiously, hoping to find a direction, but there were no other tracks. The prints seemed to appear from nowhere and end in the same instant. I packed as quickly as possible, constantly checking over my shoulder. Every tree felt like it was hiding something. Every shift of wind sounded like movement. I didn't eat, didn't rest, just moved until I reached the forest. I thought leaving the forest would give me relief, but instead, a new realization settled into my chest. Whoever opened my tent had to know I was awake. They had to know I was listening, and they chose not to speak, not to touch anything, not to take anything. They just watched. That's the part that still unnerves me years later. Not the footprints, not the zipper sound, not even the pressure against the tent. It's the thought that someone out there moves through those woods silently enough to appear and disappear without leaving a trail. Someone patient enough to stand still in the dark for hours. Someone who didn't come to hurt me. Not that night, just to watch, and maybe to decide whether or not there was a return. The strange part is that I almost didn't go that night. I had a feeling in my gut telling me to stay home, but I ignored it the way people ignore warnings they can't explain. I had been planning a camping trip for weeks, and backing out because of a vague sense of dread felt ridiculous. So I packed my gear, filled my water bottles, and drove toward the old ridge trail that cut through the quietest parts of the forest. Looking back, that quiet was the problem. The trail was overgrown, with ferns brushing my legs and thorny branches catching my skin. It seemed obvious no one came too often, and I liked that at first. It felt like having an entire forest to myself. The sun was warm, the air dry, and for the first hour everything felt normal. I reached a spot where two massive boulders sat on either side of the narrow path. Someone had carved markings into one of them, simple straight lines arranged in sets of three. I assumed they were old survey marks or something left by people. Past the boulders, the forest turned. The trees grew closer together, trunks leaning at odd angles like they were trying to feel ground. The canopy blocked out much of the light, leaving a dim, muted glow that made it impossible to tell the time just by looking at it. I kept walking until I reached a flat patch of ground near a cluster of thin spruce trees. The place felt unnervingly quiet, but it was the best spot I had found. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and tried to settle in. I kept glancing toward the boulder pass in the distance, the carved lines and the stone flashing all around. Something bothered me about them, so I couldn't finish my thought. I pushed the thought away and focused on preparing for it. Dusk arrived fast. The forest swallowed the light in a way that felt unnatural, even though I knew it was just the density of the trees. I let the fire burn bright, its orange glow bouncing off the trunks like shifting shadows. I I sat there listening to the crackle of the flame, waiting for the forest to make its usual night sound, but nothing came. Not a single chirp, not a single rustle. It was like everything had left. The first sign of trouble came when I heard a soft thud from the tent. Not loud enough to be a falling rain, not sharp enough to be a rock. It sounded like something landing on the ground deliberately. I froze, listening. Another thud followed, a little closer. Then another, each one spaced evenly like footsteps. I held my breath and let the fire die low so my eyes could adjust to the dark. The footsteps circled the campsite slowly, cautious and steady. I strained to hear breathing and movement in the brush, but the forest remained utterly still. After a few minutes, the steps stopped. Nothing else happened. No retreat, no advancing. Just silence. Eventually, I crawled into my tent. The moment I zipped it shut, I regretted it. The thin fabric created a bubble of darkness too small to feel safe in. Every sound felt amplified. Every gust of wind felt like movement. Time passed. Maybe an hour. Maybe less. I wasn't sure. Then I heard it again. A single step. Right behind the tent. The sound pressed the air out of my lungs. I stared at the ceiling of the tent, frozen, every muscle locked. The step didn't repeat, but something began to tap lightly against the ground near me. A slow, rhythmic tapping. It reminded me of someone testing the soil with their finger. I waited, terrified to leave. The tapping stopped. Then the zipper moved. It was subtle, just a twitch of the metal pulled shut behind the tent. Not opening, just nudging, like someone was checking if it would slide. The sound was so soft I thought I imagined it, but when I leaned closer, the zipper twitched again. That was enough. I grabbed the small pocket knife and kept it in my sleeping bag, useless against anything serious, and waited. No more movement came. The forest went still again, and eventually fatigue overpowered me. I didn't fall asleep, exactly. I drifted in and out, startled awake by every tiny movement. At first light, I rushed outside, half expecting to find footprints or disturbed movement. But the ground looked untouched. The campsite looked unchanged. Even the area behind the tent, where I had heard the step, was clean. But something was different. The boulder with the carved lines had another setting. 3 new marks, freshly etched, the grooves pale and crisp compared to the older ones. I knew they weren't there the day before. I would have noticed. Someone had carved them during the night, not far from where I slept. I packed up immediately. As I crossed back through the boulder path, I saw something else. On the second boulder, hidden behind a curl of moss, someone had carved a crude outline of his indication. Just a simple shape, arms and legs, but the head was turned to the side, facing the direction of my campsite. My pace quickened. The forest felt tighter, as if the trees leaned closer on each side. Halfway down the trail, I felt eyes on me. I didn't look back. I kept walking. The sense of being watched grew stronger, following me all the way to the edge of the forest. When I reached my car, I finally turned around. The trail behind me looked empty. Just trees, just shadows. But there, on the trunk of the nearest tree, was a fresh set of 3 carved lines, pale against the bark, scraped with something sharp. Made that moment, I drove home shaken, replaying the night over and over. I never saw anyone. I never heard a voice. I never found a footprint. Only those carvings, increasingly noted, following the direction I traveled, marking the forest like a silent map. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up trail reports, old ranger logs, anything mentioned the strange markings. I didn't find much, just scattered notes from hikers who mentioned symbols carved in the trees. Most described the same pattern of tree lines. None of them knew what they meant, but one detail kept repeating. People who saw the markings always felt like they were alone in the forest. And the carvings always appeared in places no one should have been able to reach quietly. I still wonder if someone followed me that night. Someone who knew the forest better than before. Someone who watched from the trees, close enough to touch the tent, close enough to mark the stones in the wood. Someone who wanted me to read. And someone who didn't want me to forget that they were there. I still think about that night whenever I hear branches snapping in the distance. It doesn't matter if I'm hiking or camping, or just walking around the woods. The sound takes me straight back to the forest, to the moment I realized I wasn't alone out there, no matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise. I had gone camping with the intention of disconnecting. Too much time indoors, too much noise, too much routine. The forest felt like the only place left where I could breathe normally. A co-worker told me about a small, hidden lake deep in a remote stretch of woods. place without cell service or crowd, perfect for a quiet weekend. I decided that was exactly what I needed. The hiking was peaceful. The light filtered through the leaves in soft waves. The ground smelled like damp earth, and the lake revealed itself slowly behind the veil of trees. It was beautiful in a simple, untouched way. I set my tent near the water, unpacked, and took in the scene. The lake was still, almost reflective, with no ripples except those made by the occasional wind. Fallen logs stretched into the water like a natural pool. The air felt heavy under the surface, cooling the foot. I spent the first hour exploring, walking around the shoreline, noticing small details like claw marks on a tree and a patch of moss peeled back as if something large had moved across it. I told myself it was normal. Animals lived here. I was the outsider. As evening settled, I cooked a small meal and watched the lake turn darker until it blended with the forest behind it. That was when I heard the first sound, a faint splash like something dipping a foot or hand into the water. I assumed it was a fish or maybe a bird, but when I looked up, the surface was calm again, completely still. The air grew colder. My fire crackled quietly, and the light bounced deeply against the tall trees. The forest around the lake felt strangely tight, as if the shadows gathered closer as the night came. I brushed the uncomfortable feeling off and climbed into my tent when the fire died out. I drifted in and out of sleep until a sudden noise snapped me awake. It was subtle, but long enough that my body reacted before my mind did. A soft crunch of leaves. Not wind, not an animal stirring, a deliberate step. I sat there trying to stay quiet. Another step followed, then a pause, then another. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was moving slowly, as they were trying not to be noticed. I leaned closer to the tent wall and held my breath. The steps circled the edge of the campsite, never rushing, never stopping for long. The weight sounded uneven, the gait irregular. It made my stomach flip. I didn't want to imagine he walked like that. Eventually the steps stopped near the lake. I waited, straining to hear something. For a long moment, the forest returned to silence. Then came the sound of water shifting. A slow disturbance, like someone stepping into the lake up to their ankles. I wasn't brave enough to unzip it. I stayed inside, eyes wide open, clutching my backpack as a protection. After several minutes, the water went still again. Then nothing. Not a single sound. The silence stretched so long it almost felt loud. I must have dozed off again, because the next thing I remembered was waking to the faint rustling behind me. My tent wall was moving, brushing inward slightly, as if someone was brushing their hand around the outside. The pressure traveled slowly downward, and sideways, tracing the outline of the thing. I froze completely. My chest barely rose with each breath. The movement stopped behind my head, and the fabric pulled in a little more, like someone leaning in. I felt the faintest vibration in the ground, a shift of weight that couldn't have been wind or imagination. Whoever was out there was inches away from me. I stayed still until the pressure finally disappeared. Minutes passed before I gathered enough courage to move. Just before dawn, I exited the tent. The air felt sharp and cold. My camping gear was undisturbed, but near the waterline I saw something that made my stomach fall. The soil held impressions from bare feet. Not animal tracks, human footprints. Large, spaced unevenly, leading into and out of the lake. I followed them cautiously, heart pounding. The footprints got shallower near the tree line, and then stopped abruptly. No trail, no disturbed roots, no drag marks, as if whoever made them had stood still for a long time, and then simply vanished into the forest without leaving a trace. I packed fast. Every minute out there felt like a minute wasted. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watched. On the hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was pacing me from a distance. Occasionally I heard soft snaps of branches far behind me. Never too close, but never fading completely. Just far enough to stay unseen. I reached my car shaking, exhausted, and flooded with relief. But as I opened the trunk to toss my backpack in, something on the fabric caught my eye. A wet handprint stained the side of the pack. It was smeared downward, like someone had grabbed it with dripping fingers. The shape was unmistakably human, and the water had dried into a faint outline by the time I saw it, meaning it hadn't been from the lake that morning. It had happened during the night. At some point while I slept, the same person who walked into the lake, the same person who circled my tent and touched my backpack, lifted it, pressed their wet hand against it, and put it back exactly where it was. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. It sounded too strange, too unreal to explain. But even now, years later, I can still hear the quiet steps circling my feet. I can still picture the footprints leading into the lake. I can still feel the pressure of someone standing just behind me, separated only by thin fabric. And sometimes, when I look at old camping gear or feel water drying on my skin, I think about that nearly perfect handprint, still stained faintly into the material despite all the washes. I think about the footprints that disappeared without a trail. I think about the shifting water in the middle of the night. And I wonder how long that person watched me before I even realized they were there. I still remember the exact moment the forest stopped feeling like a place and became something closer to a warning. It was the third evening of our camping trip, the kind of quiet dusk when the light fades so slowly that you don't notice how dark it has become until the shadows are already holding onto your ankles. We had chosen a remote part of the ridge, far from any official trails, because we wanted silence and space. At least, that was what we thought we wanted. By the time we realized what we had stumbled into, that silence felt like a trap snapping shut around us. I had wandered a little away from camp to wash my hands in a narrow stream. The water was freezing, the kind that numbs your fingers almost instantly, but it felt refreshing after the long hike. When I straightened up, I heard something subtle behind me, like a foot shifting on dried leaves. I turned, expecting to see one of my friends, but there was no one there. The trees stood close together, forming a dense wall of trunks, and the forest floor was uneven with old roots and moss. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just a squirrel or some other small animal. But there was something off about the timing, as if whatever made the sound was waiting for me to turn my back. I hurried back to camp, trying not to show how uneasy I felt. The fire was burning low, sending thin trails of smoke straight up into the calm air. My friends were sitting close to the flames, talking quietly. Something about their expressions made me pause before stepping into the light. They weren't scared, exactly, but they were unsettled, like they were trying to talk themselves out of something. They told me they had spotted someone earlier. A man standing far off between the trees, barely visible through the shifting branches. They couldn't make out his face, but they said he was facing the camp, completely still. When they tried to look again, he was gone. They tried to laugh it off as a hunter or another camper, but the nearest official campsite was miles away, and the idea of someone wandering alone through such an isolated forest didn't sit right with any of us. As night settled in, the temperature dropped sharply. Our fire became the only warm circle of light in the vast darkness, and we found ourselves inching closer to it. Every little sound beyond its glow made us tense. A snap of a twig, a rustle in the brush. Even the wind moving through the branches felt heavy and deliberate. I kept glancing toward the direction of the stream, where I had heard that shift in the leaves, half expecting to see someone standing there. We eventually crawled into our tents, but none of us slept well. My body felt wired, every muscle tight. I kept imagining footsteps approaching the tent, imagining a silhouette moving just outside the thin layer of fabric. Several times I thought I heard breathing nearby, steady and slow, but I couldn't be sure if it was real or just the forest twisting itself into my mind. Sometime deep in the night, I heard movement again. This time it wasn't subtle. It was the heavy, deliberate crunch of a boot pressing into dry leaves. Then another. Then another. Slow, careful steps circling the perimeter of our camp. I held my breath, staring at the roof of my tent as the footsteps stopped right beside me. There was no light, but I could feel the presence, like a weight pressing through the nylon wall. A part of me wanted to unzip the tent and check, but something deeper inside kept me frozen. If I looked, I felt certain I would see something I wasn't meant to. The footsteps eventually drifted away, fading into the forest. I waited a long time, barely breathing, before I heard one of my friends shift in their tent. They whispered my name, asking if I was awake. Neither of us dared to leave the tent or even speak loudly. We waited for dawn like people waiting for rescue. As soon as light filtered through the canopy, we emerged. The fire had died out completely, leaving only a circle of pale ash. The ground around our tents was disturbed. Leaves flattened, soil shifted, footprints, several of them, human, large, deep. They circled our tents in a slow, deliberate loop, as if someone had been studying us carefully. We didn't even discuss staying. We packed in near silence, each of us glancing repeatedly into the trees, expecting to see someone watching. As we prepared to leave, one of my friends pointed out something none of us had noticed the previous nights. About 20 meters from camp, nailed into a tree, was a piece of wood the size of a hand. Carved into it was a crude symbol, a shape that looked like a circle with something like a vertical slash through its center. The edges of the wood were darkened, as if it had been burned. We approached slowly. A thin cord hung from the bottom of the wooden marker, holding 3 small objects. They were smooth stones, each with lines scratched into them. One stone had a marking that looked like a crooked X. Another had parallel lines carved in a pattern. The last one had no lines at all, but was stained a dark color that made my stomach turn. None of us wanted to touch the marker. It didn't feel like something old or abandoned. It felt recent, deliberate, personal, and placed there for someone to find. Maybe even for us. We made our way back toward the trail with a kind of focused panic, trying not to break into a full sprint. The forest felt hostile now, every branch like a hand reaching out, every rustle like someone following close behind. Several times we stopped because one of us swore they heard footsteps. Not running, just following, keeping pace. When we finally reached the trailhead and stepped out into the open, we didn't look back. We got in the car and drove faster than we should have down the winding road. The whole time, I kept checking the mirrors, half convinced I would see a figure standing at the edge of the trees. A week later, one of my friends sent me a link he found online. It showed a report about an unmarked campsite discovered deep in that same forest. Rangers had found rough tools, ropes, piles of bones, animal bones, they said, but some of the fragments looked unsettlingly large. They also found several wooden symbols identical to the one near our camp. The report didn't say who made them or if anyone was found. It ended with a warning advising hikers to avoid remote areas of that forest. I haven't gone camping since. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear those slow footsteps circling the edge of the darkness, as if whoever was in that forest hasn't stopped looking. Even now, I keep wondering if we left in time, or if we were already marked the moment we saw that symbol nailed to the tree. I didn't understand the meaning of real fear until the morning we decided to take the old logging road into the national forest. It wasn't on any of the common hiking maps, and that was the point. We wanted a remote spot, a quiet place to camp where no one would bother us. The first mistake was assuming that being alone in a forest is ever a good thing. The second mistake was not turning around the moment we realized how unnatural the silence felt there, as if the deeper we walked, the more the world around us was holding its breath. The road had long faded into little more than 2 shallow grooves in the dirt, swallowed by weeds and fallen branches. We followed it until it simply disappeared into undergrowth. By then we were too curious to stop. We pushed farther in, stepping over rotting logs and ducking under low branches heavy with moss. The canopy hung thick above us, muting the sunlight until everything had a soft, dim glow. It felt like being underwater, the air strangely still. We found a clearing around midday. It wasn't large, just a patch where the trees thinned enough for light to reach the ground. But something felt off. It wasn't the clearing itself, but the way it seemed unnaturally clean. No fallen branches, no old leaves, no animal tracks or signs of anything living passing through. The ground was bare, smoothed in a way I couldn't explain. My friends said we were being paranoid, that it was just wind or rain that caused it, but the soil looked untouched, almost swept. Still, it seemed like the best place to camp. We dropped our bags and set up the tents, forcing light conversation to distract from the strange emptiness. As evening settled in, we built a fire and ate, trying to convince ourselves that nothing was wrong. But the quiet was suffocating. No birds calling, no insects humming. Even the wind barely moved through the branches. The forest felt like a room with thick walls, holding every sound inside and letting nothing escape. At one point, while gathering extra wood, I noticed the trees surrounding the clearing. Their trunks had long, narrow scrapes, all at the same height, as if something had dragged a tool or blade along the bark. The marks were old but distinct, running almost perfectly level around several trunks. When I pointed them out, my friends brushed it off as logging equipment from decades ago. But the marks were too precise, too recent-looking, and there were no cut stumps nearby to suggest actual logging. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my tent listening to the faint crackling of the dying fire. Every so often, I thought I heard something in the distance. Not footsteps or voices, just a sort of shifting sound, as if something large was moving slowly through the brush. The kind of sound a deer might make, except it paused too often and lingered in one spot as though observing. Sometime after midnight, I sat up sharply. I didn't know why at first, only that something felt wrong. Then I realized I could hear breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Not mine. Not my friends. It came from outside the tent, close enough that it might as well have been inches from the fabric. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the rhythm was unmistakably human. The breath lingered, shallow and controlled, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. I didn't move. I didn't even swallow. I stared at the faint outline of the tent's roof as my heart hammered in my ears. The breathing stopped, replaced by a soft rustle of leaves. Then nothing. When I finally found the courage to whisper to my friends, neither of them answered. I wasn't even sure if they were awake. When dawn finally arrived, I walked out to the clearing. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw the ground. The soil that had been smooth the day before was now marked with faint impressions. Tracks. Several of them. Bare footprints. They circled the tents in wide loops. Some prints came close enough that they pressed right up to the base of the nylon. I followed them to where they vanished into the dense undergrowth. The prints were small but adult-sized, and there was no sign of shoes. Whoever had been out there had walked barefoot through the forest in the middle of the night. My friends tried to make excuses. Maybe they were our own footprints, maybe the ground had shifted. But the shape was unmistakable, and more disturbing was the fact that the prints didn't sink lightly. They dug deep, almost unnaturally so, as if the person had pressed their weight down intentionally with each step. We should have left right then, but curiosity or pride kept us there. We made plans to be more alert that night, to keep the fire burning, to stick together. As the sun began to set, the forest seemed to close in again, sealing us inside the clearing. The second night was worse. We sat close to the fire, barely speaking. The shadows beyond the light looked thicker than before, pooling between the trees like ink. At some point, one of my friends stiffened. He was staring past the glow of the fire. I followed his gaze. At first I didn't see anything, but then my eyes adjusted. Someone was standing between the trees, just far enough back that only the outline was visible. A tall, thin shape, motionless, facing us. I felt cold crawl down my spine. Before any of us could react, the figure stepped behind a tree and disappeared. We panicked. We grabbed our lights and shined them into the woods, but the beam seemed to dissolve before reaching more than a few meters. No movement, no footprints, no sound. The forest swallowed everything. None of us slept the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the figure stepping closer, crossing the clearing, crouching beside one of our tents. When dawn returned, it felt like a rescue. We didn't bother packing neatly. We shoved everything into our bags and left the clearing behind. But as we walked back toward the faded road, we found something we hadn't noticed on the way in. A narrow path, barely visible, branched off into the deeper woods. A path that had not been on any map. A path lined with more of those long, narrow scrapes on the trees. We followed it with our eyes, but none of us stepped closer. Something inside warned us that whoever stood in the shadows the night before used that path. Maybe often, maybe recently, and maybe they weren't alone. We turned and hurried back, stumbling through brush until we found the remnants of the logging road. The deeper we went, the more I felt the trees pressing in behind us, as if something was watching our retreat. Only when we finally reached the forest edge did the normal sounds return. The birds, the breeze, the distant hum of the world continuing as if nothing had happened. We never talked about the prints or the figure again. But sometimes, when I think back on that path and the smooth ground of the clearing, I wonder if we stumbled into someone's territory. Someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who watched us from the moment we arrived. And I still wonder about the breathing. The slow, steady breathing only inches from the thin wall of my tent. Because sometimes, in the middle of the night, when everything is quiet, I swear I hear that same rhythm again. Not from outside, but from somewhere closer. As if the memory isn't a memory at all. As if something followed us out of that forest, and has been waiting for the moment I finally understand what we walked into.